event. Dr. Angelica Patterson, also known as Angie, focuses her research on understanding how natural communities shift and respond to climate change, particularly trees. So she studies how trees adapt and move, and trees individually don't move, but their progeny and the seeds move, and they grow in new places. And she looks at the increasing challenges of changes in increasing average temperature and other environmental factors. Shortly, she will tell you more about the creative way she collects samples for this research, but I promised her I wouldn't spoil her surprise. Angie received her bachelor's degree in natural resources from Cornell and her master's of philosophy and PhD from Columbia University in plant ecophysiology. But she spent much of her professional career postdoctoral as an educator. She is currently the curator of education and outreach at the Miller Worley Center for the Environment at Mount Holyoke College in the Pioneer Valley in Massachusetts, near Holyoke and Amherst and Smith and UMass and Hampshire. But before going to Holyoke, she was a neighbor at the Black Rock Forest, just outside of Newburgh, New York. Black Rock Forest is a sister organization, a little bit bigger than we are, but does similar work and provides a research site for many students in New York at both universities and high schools. Angie was the master science educator at the Black Rock Forest. She gave a great seminar yesterday, a scientific seminar at the Institute, and I can assure you she is indeed a master science communicator and educator. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Angelica Patterson and have her tell us more about trees wandering in climate change. So Angie, if you will join us, it's all yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that colorful introduction. I'm going to quickly share my screen. So I am honored to be with everyone today. Very grateful to be able to talk to you about a topic that's very important to me. And the more I research it, the more it leaves me with more questions than answers. What fascinates me the most about tree responses to climate change is the incredible resilience our forest has, especially when it takes an intentional steps to protect and sustain the biodiversity within them. So today I'm thrilled to take you on a journey through an ecophysiologist lens on how trees are adapting to our changing climate. I'll be sharing some key research findings that highlight tree physiology as perhaps a factor that's driving climate-induced tree migrations, along with the ecological implications of trees species shifts on the carbon balance of Northeastern US forests. So before I delve into the talk, I'd like to map out what I'll cover today. So first, I'll be introducing you to the carbon cycle and the role that our forests play in that cycle. Then I'll present some of the factors that influence our forest carbon fluxes. I'll briefly discuss how trees are responding to climate change, showcasing some global and local observations that we're seeing today. I'll then talk about what gaps currently exist in our global carbon models, and then attempt to bridge the gap by presenting important data that I collected in my past research, and then end with some conclusions and future work and what our role will be in preserving the health of our forests. So before we can explore how our forests will be impacted under a changing climate, we have to understand how carbon is cycling globally. So in the schematic of the global carbon cycle, we can see various sources of CO2, such as fossil fuels or cement production, soil and plant respiration, land use changes, and oceans. And we also see carbon sinks, or the places where atmospheric carbon is stored, which lies in our oceans, as well as in our green spaces, through the process of photosynthesis. So there is a lot of carbon dioxide that is going into the trees, into the oceans, into the earth, and a lot that's also going out into the atmosphere. And this exchange of gases to and from the earth, which we call carbon fluxes, can sometimes not add up and isn't showing a balance. So plants and forests are an important place to look to see if we can account for some of this missing carbon. So how much CO2 can forests actually offset? Well, scientists determined that temperate forests, such as the forests that are typical to those in the Northeastern US, as well as tropical forests, are actually very large sinks of CO2. And that over the span of a couple decades or so, temperate forests have increased their ability to store carbon dioxide by 33%. And while at the same time, tropical forests have actually declined theirs due to things like deforestation, where they cut down large areas of trees. Reasons as to why temperate forests can remain a large sink or storage place for carbon dioxide is due to an increased growth of our forests after a reduction of large-scale agriculture, cow grazing, and wood harvesting. And in addition, the amount of carbon dioxide that's going into the atmosphere, as well as nitrogen, an important element for plants to grow, has also increased, which has led to increased plant biomass density and land area for growth. So using canopy level carbon flux measurements and satellite data, researchers actually estimated that 20% of US carbon emissions come from the Northeast, and that if the Northeast was a country, it actually be tied fifth place as emitting the most CO2 into the atmosphere. However, the temperate forests of the Northeast can offset up to about 40% of US carbon emissions annually, which highlights the contribution that this region's forest has on mitigating climate change. So to understand how forest carbon dynamics may change under a warmer climate, we need to understand how trees are cycling carbon and determine if they will be able to acclimate or adapt their physiology to optimal levels, ensuring a physiological competitiveness that is needed for them to survive, to grow, and to reproduce. So the physiological process that will actually dictate this is photosynthesis, in which plants take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, water from the soil, and use light energy from the sun to produce the sugars that is needed to grow and the oxygen that is required for us to breathe. And it's through respiration, which is the opposite of photosynthesis, where plants break down the sugars that they produced by using oxygen and metabolic energy to produce carbon dioxide, water, and also energy that is needed to then power photosynthesis. And that all sustains a tree's growth, reproduction, and repair. So for plants, photosynthesis and respiration are very tightly linked together, and one cannot happen without the other. So in this presentation, I'll be talking a lot about the rate of photosynthesis or respiration. But, what do I mean by that? So if you are a car enthusiast, it's like describing whether your metabolism is like the engine of a Ford or an engine of a Ferrari. And I'm not knocking Fords. I know they have fans. It's just two types of engines that can actually get you to the same destination. But which one actually has that innate potential to propel through that carbon fixation process at a faster rate? And understanding this will actually give us an indication of how fast these plants can grow, or how fast that they can turn carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into energy. So the process of photosynthesis and respiration, like I mentioned before, go hand in hand, but they can be influenced by a number of environmental factors, such as nitrogen supply, soil moisture, light, and stand age, could actually influence the rate of photosynthesis, while respiration depends on some things such as soil environment, leaf area, and photosynthetic rate. However, the rates of both of these processes are also dependent on temperature and can actually differ depending on the type of species that's operating these processes. So let's look at how temperature has changed in the Northeastern United States. So over the last 126 years, the average annual temperatures in the Northeastern US has become much warmer. The graph on the bottom actually shows the departure of the average annual temperatures from the 20th century average over time. And if we were to look closely at the latter years only, the warming has actually increased at a faster rate of about 0.5 degree Fahrenheit per decade. And if we look at over 100 years, it's risen by about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, you see some interannual variability where you have some years that are cooler than other years, but generally over the last decade, the departure from the mean has been consistently above the century average. If you look above here in New York alone, the 2024 summer temperatures have actually departed from the century average by about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit alone. So that's pretty significant. So scientists have observed and have come to understand that plants have always moved or migrated to environments that are best suited for them. And this has been happening ever since the last ice age ended over 11,000 years ago. But because the climate is changing over the land in every part of the world and doing so very fast, plants are actually having a hard time keeping up. And in fact, scientists think that they need to migrate up to 10 times faster than they did before in order to track their preferred climate and to be successful. This article that actually influenced me into learning more about this and really giving me direction for this research stated that the percentage of species that's quote unquote committed to extinction based on maximum climate warming for 2050 is estimated to be between 20 to 50%, depending on the ability for tree species to disperse or migrate to new areas. So, without the help of humans to actively migrate plants to better areas with suitable climates, we asked, how will plants respond to this rapid change in air temperature if they were to stay right where they are? Now you're probably asking, wait, plants can migrate or move? Well, I'll let you judge for yourself.
Where are they going?
They have business with the orcs. My business is with Isengard tonight, with rock and stone. Come, my friends. The Ents are going to war. It is likely that we go to our doom. Last march of the Ents.
That was actually live footage I took the other day. No, well, I'm sorry to say that plants can't actually move like animals do, right? They don't have legs and are instead sessile organisms. So how do they migrate? Well, they depend on seed dispersal, or the movement of their seeds, in order to successfully establish themselves and reproduce to ensure a thriving population. Some other observations that scientists have documented include a lengthening of a plant's growing season. So we all know that plants grow during the year when it's the perfect temperature and the perfect length of daylight for them to photosynthesize or use the sun's energy to grow. However, with the temperatures outside getting warmer year after year, scientists are noticing that the growing season for plants is becoming longer and that the flowers that plants produce for successful reproduction are opening up earlier. Scientists are also seeing migration, where species ranges are either shifting or contracting and or expanding. But the migration patterns generally aren't resulting in plants just moving anywhere. We're finding that plants are moving or migrating northward, like up towards Canada or up mountains, which are cooler and less stressful than where they are now. So let's take a look at this photo. So scientists took photos of a mountainside in Sweden near the Arctic tree line, as depicted by these black lines. These tree lines mark the boundary where conditions inhibit the growth of shrubs and trees. And in 1977, you can notice that shrubs actually ceased to pass this line. However, as the climate conditions became more favorable, shrubs and trees have expanded their range and actually moved up towards the mountain. So generally, how will plants respond to climate change? Well, trees can respond in one of three ways. They can either persist, they can either migrate to suitable habitat, or become extirpated from the local region. So here we could see that under different emission scenarios, the temperatures of New York State could actually start to feel like the temperatures that would occur as far south as Georgia. In my presentation, you'll hear me reference New York State due to the study site that was located, but you can imagine the same scenarios and questions being asked in reference to your location. So in regards to the questions, the three important ones rose to the top as I began contemplating the changes that would happen in force where I studied. I started to ask, what would happen to these New York trees, which aren't used to Georgia temperatures? Will the forests in Georgia begin to migrate up to New York? And what species will be able to actually survive here? So of course, for plants, the first line of defense is persistent, which requires species to be long-living, to have high stress tolerances, and produce dormant seeds. And these traits describe the northern red oak, which is the dominant tree species in the New York region. So its range is centrally located here, and they're able to tolerate a range of temperatures that occur in the warmer regions of the south and the cooler regions of the north. But projections on abundance and habitat suggest that certain areas will actually lose abundance, while northern areas increase abundance and suitable habitat, while still being able to maintain its full range. Carrier glabra, or pignut hickory, is a southern ranged species whose northern edge hits the Hudson Highlands region of New York. And as temperatures become warmer, its predicted abundance is and range is noted to not only expand, but to also extend northward, as you can see by the darkening of the yellow. And there have been predictions of species range shifts, such as the one shown here for paper birch. So southern individuals of paper birch used to occur in southern New York forests, with higher abundance occurring northward towards Canada. However, this model predicts that paper birch is decreasing in abundance in their current areas and completely moving out of this region. A study published in 2008 by collaborators at Black Rock Forest in Hudson Highlands region of New York, summarized these changes in forest composition over the span of 76 years. And in total, they found that 3 tree species became locally extinct or were extirpated from the region or from the forest, and 11 had migrated in from the south, either naturally or anthropogenically. And the species that had minimal abundance and became extirpated include the northern ranged species of black spruce and paper birch. Dutch elm's disease was a fungal disease that eradicated most of the living American elm trees, which had a central range distribution in this part of the nation. And to the right here, I'm showing 2 out of the 11 southern range tree species that have migrated in, which have been included as study samples in my research. And that includes the southern catalpa and tulip poplar. And here are a few more photos of predominantly southern range trees, which include the American sycamore, red mulberry, pignut hickory, black gum, and Ailanthus altissima, which is tree of heaven, which is regarded as non-native to North America. So what consequences can come about if trees from differing climatic provenances experience temperature regimes they may not be adapted to? So this schematic shows what could happen if populations experience a mismatch with future climate. So on the left picture, blue trees are currently living in the colder climates that they've become adapted to, while yellow trees are living under the warmer climates that they've adapted to, with green trees living somewhere in the middle of that range. And with climate change, we can expect to get a mismatch between the genotypes of populations and the climate that they find themselves in, as the cold environment becomes warm and the warm environment becomes hot. The gray trees actually represent mortality or health problems associated with a maladaptation to the new climate that they're experiencing. We know that as climate becomes warmer, the physiological responses of trees experiencing a new temperature regime that they've not adapted to can result in tree migration or mortality events that lead to species replacements and changes in their region's carbon storage potential. So for example, oaks have been around the Northeastern US forest for thousands of years. And since the ending of large-scale agriculture over 200 plus years ago, they've become the dominant tree species here. We also know that their long-term persistence is due to inherent physiological and physical traits once they've established and matured. And their dominance and the regrowth of our forest has actually helped make this region a carbon sink. Unfortunately, we also know that oaks are threatened by a number of factors that affect their ability to successfully recruit and establish new oaks in the forest. And these include a loss due to periodic disturbances, such as lightning strikes or ice storms that actually damage or kill mature oaks in the overstory. We also have an absence of fires, which has allowed for fire-sensitive species to compete with understory oaks, which have poor physiological performance compared to red maple and black birch. But one of the largest threats actually include deer browsing, which has drastically inhibited oak regeneration, making it easier for migrant or other introduced species to fill the oak's vacant niche. So the replacement of oaks by introduced or migrant tree species may not only reduce the set of important ecosystem services that oaks provide, but can negatively influence carbon storage capacity of this forest, potentially changing the forest from a sink of CO2 to a source, further perpetuating warmer atmospheric temperatures. So in one of the most recent IPCC reports, models of projected CO2 concentrations vary greatly, and in some cases over or underestimate these concentrations from the observed values that we are seeing today. An article published in BBC News highlights research being conducted that may provide evidence to support that global climate models have underestimated the amount of CO2 being absorbed by plants, as they try to explain why these models are consistently overestimating the growth rate of carbon in the atmosphere. And some scientists also say over the last 100 years, living things absorbed probably 16% more of the gas than we previously thought. And this all sounds like it may be a great thing. However, these new calculations are unlikely to make a difference to global warming predictions. And, although many of these climate models incorporate physiological traits of trees in a broad sense, they are lacking species differences and forest type differences in their models. And one of the reasons why includes a lack of empirical data. So working out the amount of carbon dioxide that is taken up by trees is critical to estimating the future impacts of CO2 on temperatures. And my research helps to bridge that gap by providing empirical data on the physiological responses to temperature of many tree species that had little to no data at all. So, as a plant ecophysiologist, I wanted to ask these sets of questions. Why are trees migrating in and out of black rock forests? Is it because the climate is too warm for some and better for others? Is it because some trees are growing faster than others through photosynthesis and respiration? And how is this connected with where these trees originally came from, whether they were predominantly northern ranged, southern ranged, or centrally ranged to here? But before we can answer these questions, we need to understand how trees grow and how climate change can affect that growth. So to understand more about how the trees in New York will fare under a warming climate, I had set forth to conduct research at Black Rock Forest. It's located about an hour and a half north of New York City along the Hudson. It's approximately a 4,000 acre preserve that is predominantly oak. And it's also a great place to do this type of work due to the long-term research they have on species replacement over the last 90 years. And it's also a site where we see these tree range distributions overlap. Luckily for me, I had no shortage of recruiting volunteers to help collect branch samples that I used in my study. Using the shotgun method, we were able to retrieve canopy tree branches growing in full sunlight to reduce the variation in the physiological responses of the sampled leaves. Producers from The Verge Science came to Black Rock Forest to interview me about my work and showcase how I collected my samples. And I'd like to share that with you today.
This race is on display in Black Rock Forest, just north of New York City, where for years, Angie has been keeping tabs on the movement of tree species, including the northern red oak.
Very important tree species in this forest because it makes up about 70% of the forest composition.
As the climate shifts, new trees are also moving in, and the future of the red oak and the whole forest is uncertain.
So I'm comparing the physiological responses to temperature of trees in order to see if there's a physiological mechanism that's driving tree migration.
To learn how Black Rock's trees respond to changing temperatures, Angie needed leaves.
You want to make sure that you have a clean shot because believe me, I've had plenty of leaves with holes in it.
For Angie, the best leaves to study were all the way at the top of the canopy because they get a consistent and even amount of sunlight.
So we're going to want to go to the branch towards the middle there, right in that open space.
But those leaves are really hard to get to, hence the heavy weaponry.
The shotgun was actually a very efficient and cheap way to collect my samples.
Over the course of 3 years, Angie used her shotgun to collect leaves from 23 tree species, including the red oak.
Fire!
Using a device called a lycor, she subjected the leaves to different temperatures and CO2 levels and measured their photosynthesis and respiration.
Covering the chamber completely.
Basically, she wanted to see how each of the species would respond to different swings in the climate.
And then I compared their photosynthetic rates and respiration rates as temperatures increase.
She found
Hey, I'm not going to give away the answer of what I found yet. We are going to understand how trees respond to increases in temperature physiologically. So this graph shows the response of both photosynthesis and respiration to temperature. So each species has a different optimal temperature at which photosynthesis or carbon gain is at its highest. And in return, respiration or carbon loss is low enough to maximize this net carbon gain. And as temperatures increase, photosynthesis deviates from its optimum and decreases, and respiration increases, decreasing that net photosynthesis. So in this scenario, the temperature response of this plant's physiology is not able to acclimate or have the ability to compensate by changing their physiology back to optimal levels. However, in an acclimation scenario, the photosynthetic and respiration rate would actually bounce back to a similar optimum at a new temperature. So Smith and Duke published a graph showing the physiological response to a stimulus through time and lays out when acclimation and eventual adaptation would occur. The respiration and photosynthetic response to warming is symbolized by the dotted and dashed line, respectively. After warming, the photosynthetic response increases and dips before it reaches homeostasis at a rate that is similar to where it began. And similarly, with respiration, we find an instantaneous increase and leveling off at a rate similar to before the stimulus. So Smith and Duke summarized an experiment where red oaks were grown in the field under 3 different temperatures. Cool, ambient, and warm grown plants showed similar assimilation rates or photosynthesis once the plants got used to their new growing temperatures. So if the physiology of these northern, central, and southern range trees actually acclimated to its growing environment, we would probably expect to find a similar pattern where these groups would have exhibited similar rates of photosynthesis to each other. As for respiration, studies have found that trees could exhibit one of 2 types of acclimation. So here's a graph of these. Both of these graphs are a graph of respiration response on the y-axis to temperature on the x-axis. And in both types 1 and type 2, a plant that's grown under ambient temperatures will show an exponential increase in respiration when temperature increases. However, for type 1 acclimation, when a warm grown plant are exposed to high temperatures, their respiration rates will be lower than a plant that did not experience a temperature change. So for my study, I attribute this response to a short-term acclimation and expect this response to occur in mature existing leaves that were once in their ambient temperature and are then exposed to a high temperature. And in type 2 acclimation, describes a more long-term response to temperature, where, for example, a new plant or a new leaf were to grow under a new temperature regime. So here we would find rates of respiration not only differing at low temperatures, but also showing lower rates under higher temperatures. So in my experiments, I would expect a combination of these acclimation responses to measurements taken on mature existing leaves or new grown leaves. But for today's presentation, I'll be presenting what happens on mature existing leaves. So after taking a host of gas exchange measurements on leaves from 23 different species under elevated temperatures, we found some very interesting trends that not only show differences across species, but differences across range distribution categories, or northern, central, and southern trees. So in summary, we found that northern ranged trees had the highest rates of respiration or carbon loss under elevated temperatures, whereas central ranged and southern ranged trees, such as the central range trees, such as red oak, had similar rates of respiration to southern range trees as temperatures elevated. When we look at these range groups' physiology, when exposed to an ambient temperature of about 23 or 25 degrees Celsius, the rate of photosynthesis or carbon gain in the top graph, and their carbon use efficiency, which is simply the ratio of carbon gain to carbon loss, which is the bottom graph, do not significantly differ from each other, which suggests that these trees may have acclimated to this region's current growing temperatures. Now, keep in mind that as average air temperatures increase, these ratios could likely change as well and show a different response altogether. Now, the next graphs show the photosynthetic capacity, or we term it the VC max, which, if you remember a few slides back, gives us an indication of how fast a tree can metabolize that carbon that they assimilate. So here we found a good amount of variation that resulted in significant differences in the photosynthetic capacity across species. When these species were grouped, we found that central range trees actually had a lower capacity to assimilate carbon dioxide than their northern and southern counterparts. So this suggests that central range trees may have a physiological disadvantage, which could result in the reduction of growth and reproduction rates when compared to their southern and northern counterparts. Although the variability of photosynthetic capacity was not strong enough to detect a significant interaction effect between the range group and temperature, the photosynthetic capacity of central range trees, which is here in orange, not only trended lower than the northern and southern trees, but seemed to have trended up at ambient levels and then downward under elevated temperatures. So these results may indicate that trees central to this region, like the northern red oak, may be at a physiological disadvantage compared to northern and southern trees if the climate becomes warm enough to affect their growth and ability to store carbon for our forests. The respiration results of these trees are published in the Tree Physiology Journal. So, if I could tell my past self how I would build upon the work that has now been done, I'd highlight the fact that we still need to explore the variability of physiological traits across a range of genotypes within a single species. Environmental pressures that scale across the species' geographic range is most likely location dependent and has contributed to the selections of genotypes that have been able to thrive and survive under those pressures. And this leads us to think about hybridization. We studied red oaks in the field and some of them grown in growth chamber experiments. But in fact, we also know that these red oaks hybridize a lot. So it would be interesting to see if hybridization could provide another way for plants to acclimate and survive under a warmer climate. Diving deeper into the physiological components and tracing where carbon is being allocated, such as to growth, reproduction, or simply to maintain and survive, would be worth investigating. In addition, assessing if tree species experiencing extreme weather events are likely to become physiologically resistant and less vulnerable to mortality would also be worth exploring. So when we talk about what we can do, to optimize carbon sequestration of our forests, I recommend anyone interested in this topic to read this report that came out earlier in 2024. This is a report of the Climate Forestry Committee that was based in Massachusetts. This committee was made up of 12 distinguished scientific experts to develop recommendations for the climate-oriented forest management guidelines as part of the effort to help Massachusetts achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And the key elements of the guidelines really focus on keeping forests as forests and focusing on passive management strategies to realize older forests and increase carbon stocks. But guidelines on wood production, habitat, biodiversity conservation, and even soils and water management are summarized within the report. And there most likely may be similar reports for whichever state that you are living in. I also get a lot of questions about what trees will be most climate adapted, or for more information on how vulnerable some tree species are. If you have a forest nearby or some trees in your yard, well, here are some resources that I'd like to share. The USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science jointly coordinate climate change response framework project. And one project is all about climate adapted plants and which species are most likely to fare well in a changing climate in New England and New York. They also have a thorough report that goes into what makes plants more vulnerable than others, and how they came up with the list in the first place. Another resource is a publication by Northern Woodlands that have great articles about forests and climate change. Plant ecophysiologist and forester, Dr. Ali Kosaba from the University of Vermont's Extension Office does applicable work on finding out what makes forests more climate resilient. And I have all of these resources linked in a QR code that I will show at the end, but they will also be sent out after this viewing. So as certain populations of tree species become less resilient to a changing climate, many scientists and forest managers are debating the actions that could be taken to help conserve forested communities. Assisted migration, or the intentional movement of organisms to places that would increase the probability of their future persistence, has become a hot topic of debate. And the ethics of these actions prompt us to ask ourselves, if humans should even intervene. Should we aim to preserve our lands and manage to keep them the same? Or should we accept change and let things go? Perhaps it is the end of the wild, and striving to maintain our forests to how they looked pre-colonialism is untenable. Dr. Jessica Hellman, the director of the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota, explains the debate around assisted migration in our video.
We tend to think that ecosystems should be restored to how they used to be, or how they're supposed to be, or a healthy state. And there were arguments at the time about what baseline should be used, or how humans have manipulated ecosystems historically. But when you change the climate, that baseline isn't relevant anymore. You can't go back to how this, in many cases, you wouldn't be able to go back to how the system used to be or was supposed to be.
In other words, human-induced climate change has irrevocably altered the planet. We've hit the point where instead of simply asking if or when we should get involved in moving or saving a species, we have to ask harder questions. We have to make pragmatic decisions about what is worth saving and why. And then we probably do have to intervene.
There's not a hands-off, do no harm. There's allow the climate change to proceed and do nothing, or try to intervene and also bear the consequences and the costs of that intervention. Those are the choices that climate change is presenting.
National parks are asking these questions and making these decisions now with the help of Jessica and her colleagues. They recently put together a workbook to help the Park Service think through the risks and benefits of managed relocation. It recommends asking why we want to move a species. Are we saving it because we like looking at it, or because it's critical to an ecosystem?
A lot of it has to do with ecology, of course. Can you move them? How would it work? But a lot of it does not have to do with ecology.
There are questions of resources, money, buy-in from stakeholders, from local governments, lumber producers, and hikers. What land is even available for the species to be moved to? Would someone sue? Indigenous perspectives are incredibly important too.
If you are associated with a place, or you have rights in a place, and you have cultural resources that you have been granted, climate change then becomes essentially another form of colonization. And I think that's an important value for all of us to understand and pay attention to.
Of course, managed relocation does not address the root problems facing forests. It's a treatment of symptoms. At the end of the day, the best way to protect biodiversity is, you guessed it,
We should just stop emitting greenhouse gases. That would be the more cost-effective and smarter way of going about doing this.
we need bigger actions because simply relocating trees may not be sufficient.
The idea that we're going to manage or conserve biodiversity by moving things around one by one is just not good enough. Humanity depends on the preservation of most things that are living on this earth. We need them. And moving them around is probably not going to get the job done.
Is this causing any drama with the bird researchers?
No, it has not. I've been lucky enough not to shoot down any wildlife, which is very fortunate. So to conclude, it will be up to us to ensure sustainability of our resources and conservation of our lands in order to maintain the integrity of flow of ecosystem services, which all of us benefits. With that, I leave this quote by American author Robert Jordan, who wrote, "The oak fought the wind and was broken. The willow bent when it must and survived." I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge those that I've worked with over the years who have supported me in many aspects of this work. My PhD committee members, interns, the staff at Black Rock Forest, my wonderful colleagues and friends, as well as the Griffin Bowman lab members and Columbia University's Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences and Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. And of course, the work I presented today could not have been done without funding support from NSF, the Torrey Botanical Society, Black Rock Forests, Lamont, and Columbia University. So thank you very much for listening. And it was a pleasure sharing this with you.
Thank you, Angie. That was wonderful. I've got a bunch of questions that have come in, and we had some come in with registration. I think what's really interesting to me is that a lot of the questions were questions that people asked sort of midstream, and you've sort of answered them, but let's sort of go in again. You have that QR code. As you said, we're going to send out the resources to anybody who registered, but there's this sort of tension, dynamic tension between the best practices for selecting and planting future resilient native trees in and around your house or in a small forest patch, and the impossibility of moving trees fast enough and at a scale to recover forests with climate change. Are there any sort of generalities that come out of those resources in the list of, if you're planting stuff, what the best thing to plant? Is it best to plant species, for instance, that are the same species as up here, but with seed stock from down south, or new species that are coming north slowly because it's getting warmer?
I think that's a great question. I don't think there's one right answer. I think it might take a multiple angled approach. There's going to be some species where you would transplant southern individuals or genotypes of the same species up north, and perhaps they probably maybe do better because it's like a relief for them. Or you may find that because the climate is getting wetter, right? You might need to find an alternate oak that can tolerate drought a little bit better. And maybe that would be the swamp oak. And maybe it's time to consider planting those in certain locations. I find urban foresters are well suited to kind of answer that type of question, because they're constantly thinking about how, greening up spaces in urban environments, in harsh urban environments, and with another layer of like, poorer soils or, harsher conditions. But they have to replace trees all the time. And so they are considering those types of questions.
Well, as you know, urban ecology is something Carrie is very interested in. I'm glad to see that there's yet another justification, as if we needed it, for tapping into that tremendous knowledge that urban ecosystems give us about the way the world might be. Another question that sort of appeals to me as a wildlife biologist is, I know it's not your area of expertise, but I bet you know something about how the change in tree structure and tree species and tree migration might affect wildlife.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a question that goes hand in hand, right? Because when we talk about building climate resilient forests, we're also talking about habitat, right, for animals. One of the approaches to building climate resilient forests is to make sure that plants can migrate, right, to where they need to be. And that ties into connectivity of our landscape. We have a lot of habitat fragmentation that happens, in which we have a lot of roadways cutting through our land, development, parking lots, parking garages being built, where plants seeds land and they can't grow, right? And if you can't have a habitat, you won't have the wildlife also. So I think connectivity is a big factor in that. But yeah, as the forest composition or vegetation changes, you're going to start to see those shifts. You're going to start to see, in addition, the other quote unquote wildlife, the insects, the pests, and things that come with climate as well, that can maybe have a negative effect too.
Right. Having grown up in Pennsylvania, lived in Massachusetts and New York, you're fully aware of the way climate change and warming has changed the distribution of things like ticks.
Exactly.
Right.
Absolutely.
But also, I think that's really interesting, because there's also some of these trees are dispersed by animals. And so you get a feedback loop where maybe the things that need these species will help us move them. I have a question that I'm going to ask, which is, how did you get into this? I'm always interested how people get interested in careers in science. And you clearly are interested in so many different pieces of it. Did you grow up in a forest, or did you have access as a kid, or what was it that got you into this business?
Yes. I'll probably take me back to growing up in the Poconos, right? So I was surrounded by the forest. My family, they weren't hikers, they weren't outdoorsy. I always say I was the family where we went to theme parks for vacation. But I always found myself doing things outdoors through my extracurricular activities in school. I was a Girl Scout all the way to the end, till I was like 18. And I did a lot of outdoor stuff then. And it was really in college where I was soul searching what I wanted to do. I, had a lot of trouble in my beginning years, almost flunking out. And I had to make up a science class, and the class that I took was conservation biology. And that totally changed my world.
Yeah, it's always amazing to me that a single professor can change your trajectory.
Absolutely.
Well, look, it's 7:59, so I like to end on time. Can I just say thank you so much, and thank you for your good work and for your incredible flexibility and resilience. Really appreciate it. And we will welcome you back soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. And to everybody out there, thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Sorry we couldn't do this in 3 dimensions, but hopefully in May, when we have our next Friday night at the Carry, we can do that. I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend, and thank you for ensuring that Carry Friday nights go on whether or not we can get our projector working. I hope you will tell your friends about this, and we'll see you in May. Thank you very much.